Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. We're really excited that you've joined us for our NWHM Presents Sundays at Home presentation of a walkthrough of our new virtual exhibit, Representation with a Hyphen, Latinas in the Fight for Women's Suffrage. My name is Jennifer Herrera, and I am the Vice President of External Affairs for the National Women's History Museum. Founded in 1996, the museum is the nation's only women's history museum and the most recognized institution dedicated to uncovering, interpreting, and celebrating women's diverse contributions to society. A renowned leader in women's history education, the museum brings to life the countless untold stories of women throughout history and serves as a space for all to inspire, experience, collaborate, and amplify women's impact, past, present, and future. For nearly 25 years, we've served as the largest online cultural institution dedicated to U.S. women's history, and we're excited that in the coming years, we'll finally have a physical home of our own in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, we'll continue our important work of sharing the powerful history of women in America. We hope that after today's presentation, you'll find us on social media and join us in the very important work of representation. The National Women's History Museum is offering virtual programs like this one on select Sundays each month. If you enjoy this program today, please continue to check our website, which is womenshistory.org, for more virtual programming and events, and of course, all of the great resources we have on women's history, including this brand new exhibit that we're so excited to share with you today. A few housekeeping notes. We are recording the presentation so that it can be available on our website after today. And Mariana, our exhibit curator, and our host for today will also be answering questions that you may have. So please don't be shy, put them in the chat. We're really excited that you're here and to share this with you. And now I'd like to introduce our curator and our host, Mariana Brazão, Public History Research Intern at the National Women's History Museum. Mariana graduated from the University of Virginia in May of 2019 with a BA in Foreign Affairs, Latin American Studies, and Portuguese Language and Literature. Her principal research focuses around Indigenous art, contemporary cultural policy, and the politics of museum representation. For her undergraduate thesis, she conducted a contextualization of the 2018 exhibition, The Indigenous Benches of Brazil, hosted in Sao Paulo by Colcau BEI. I hope I got that right. She was also awarded the Fulbright U.S. Student Program Research Study Grant for Brazil to continue her research into the Indigenous benches at the University of Sao Paulo School for Communication and the Arts, ECA, during the 2020 academic year. Mariana is Portuguese and Brazilian and is passionate about amplifying Latinx voices and perspectives, and we are so grateful for all of her incredible work to bring you this exhibit, and also that she's here with us at the National Women's History Museum. I'd also like to thank our partner, Telemundo, for all of their, we're bringing this to you today in partnership with them, not only this conversation, but also this wonderful exhibit. And we're so grateful for all that they have done to support women's history through their Unstoppable Women initiative, and for supporting our museum in this really great partnership. So thank you so much again for joining us. Again, please don't keep your questions to yourself. We're here to talk with you today, and we're so pleased to present to you this wonderful exhibit on Latina suffragists. Mariana?
So thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. As I mentioned, my name is Mariana Brazão, and I had the incredible opportunity for curating this exhibit, Representation with a Hyphen, Latinas in the Fight for Women's Suffrage. For me, this exhibit was extremely important because it allowed the chance to put together a cohesive story of Latinas across the country, of different heritage, and how they all contribute to this massive mark in history, the women's suffrage movement, and beyond. Today I'll be going through a virtual tour of it, kind of giving you some behind the scenes of what exactly went into it, such as the decisions I made, what made it in, the themes, and which kind of photos I chose. I hope you enjoy it, and if you have any sort of questions, like Jennifer said, please feel free to put into the Q&A, and I'll get to them at the end. All right, so getting started, I first kind of wanted to start off with the opening slide and the title, Representation with a Hyphen. I kind of drew inspiration of this from an encyclopedia called Latinas in the United States. and it's edited by Vicky Juris and Virginia Corral. And so they kind of talked about the effects of migration, daily life in diaspora, identity, biculturalism, bilingualism, race, and class. So they make note of these incredible Latina writers. So we have Nicolás Amor, Julia Alvarez, Esmeralda Santiago, Judith Ortiz-Gofer, and then Levin Morales. So, you know, they introduced these dynamics of this intergenerational cross-cultural perspective that spoke to this other reality or coalescence, you know, the synthesis of both the heritage of having heritage from Hispanic and Latino communities, but also living in the US. So that sort of duality. And then Levin Morales actually wrote in her Child of America's poem, she goes, "I am new. History made me. My first language was Spanish. I was born at the crossroads, and I am whole." And so as I started to dig deep into the research for this exhibition, there was one theme that just kept coming out, and that was really pertinent, and that was this dedication to celebrating and amplifying these Latinas and their Hispanic culture. So when I was thinking of the title, I didn't want to just keep it at Latinas in the fight for women's suffrage. I wanted to kind of pay homage to that duality of living life as on a hyphen. You know, oftentimes identities are hyphenated, you know, Mexican American, Cuban American. So representation with a hyphen was supposed to sort of embody that. So I started with the story of Lucrecia Del Valle, and I actually came across her, our exhibit advisor, who was great in putting resources and helping get this together, Kathleen Cahill. She brought her story to my attention, and there's an article written by Margie Brown Coronel, which kind of touches upon her life. And so Lucrecia Del Valle, you know, this coming of age story that really resonated with me. She grows up in California. In 1911, California passes a proposition allowing women the right to vote. And she sees that as a reference and also as part of a very elite California politically connected family. So she spends her early years in California, and her paternal grandmother, actually Isabel Del Valle, gave her representation to women in power in these family networks, you know, the Spanish Mexican women who exercise their rights as landowners, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders. Isabel was also a huge figure in California society, and so her visits to the ranch and time with her grandmother kind of really gave her that perspective. Her father, Reginaldo Del Valle, also was the first representative of Spanish Mexican heritage to be elected to the state assembly. And I didn't get to include the story because there's just so much always to kind of cut and choose, but she actually went on a visit to Mexico with her father as a special US envoy to research factions of the Mexican Revolution. And so you have a lot of newspaper coverage, you know, citing her as an example of women's diplomatic participation. So in the notes she left about her life, she says that this experience really kind of had a big influence on the trajectory of her work afterwards. So, you know, you get her politicized in these early years. Her family serves as, you know, this heritage of citizenship, public service, and women's civic prominence, which really shaped her political awareness. So as I touch upon here in the exhibition, she takes up this role of Senora Yorba in the mission play, and her family really sees that as an opportunity to concretize the Spanish-Mexican past of California and in the early settlement of the state. So she's wearing her family heirlooms to kind of give that direct connection, and her father's actually investing in the production to kind of make that statement. Fortunately, the mission play has a bit of a failed tour. She goes to University of Chicago and realizes she wants to pursue the study of politics. So she moves to New York and attends Columbia's Department of Political Philosophy in 1917. And in this moment, she sees herself lose the right to vote, and she becomes disenfranchised because in California, it passed in 1911. Then in 1917, she's in New York, and New York still hasn't passed the right for women's vote. So she's studying politics, and she transforms these studies in her classroom into real life. And so you see that, you know, that movement from the classroom, transformation in theater to political activism. And so these two photos that I actually included are from a family collection, David Bodie Bailey, and I thought they were kind of represented just this empowerment that she kind of had. The first one is actually from The Landslide, which was performed in Lyceum in October and November 1912. And then the second photo is that stance of, you know, this modern American woman on her ranch, and the Los Angeles Times actually cited her as, you know, this member of this California elite. So as I mentioned, I include here a picture of her with her parents, and I wanted to use this picture as the title slide to kind of pull out the themes for the exhibition. So using Lucrecia's story, I wanted to make note at, the fact that women's suffrage was not limited to one moment in history. It's hard to put just a specific date or a timeline. Activism was happening from east to west coast, from north to south, different moments before 1920 and after. And we kind of see that with her, from her move from California to New York and becoming disenfranchised. Secondly, I also want to touch on a theme that I'll get to more broadly here, and that's this rich history of Spanish Mexican women being extremely influential in family and local networks prior to U.S. occupation and the end of the Mexican-American War. And we see that, exemplified by Isabel, maybe a more extreme example, but nonetheless representative of that theme. Thirdly, I really wanted to touch on and make it clear of this, how Hispanic and Latino culture were integral to their notions of civic duty and political activism, and that often guided how Latina women went about their organization. And then lastly, I think Lucrecia really shows the breadth of activism, right, that existed and advanced the suffrage movement, from taking up this position in the mission play to then, organizing New York. And then I'll talk about other Latina women who went from translating suffrage flyers to taking up in the press. So it just shows you that activism has many facets, and I really wanted to kind of hone in on her story to show that. And in here you'll see I included the map of Mexico prior to US in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And I kind of wanted to use it to jumpstart some important conversations surrounding race and class in the Latino community, and especially Latina suffrage movement. So Lucrecia's family did benefit from their position as treaty citizens, which were the group of people considered ambiguously white to gain collective citizenship in the US. So while they and family like themselves have indigenous, mestizo, mulatto, African, and European heritage, they often played up their whiteness and their Spanish ancestry. They're also economically stable, as seen with their Del Valle ranch, and they were known as the California elites. It's important to note that this isn't the story of all Latinas, especially Latinas of color and those of lower socioeconomic status. In the Latino community, there are divisions amongst race and class, and that had direct effects on the suffrage movement. For example, we'll see later on, there's restrictions in terms of literacy and voter suppression. So it's important to not over-romanticize this history, but to kind of reckon with this reality and think about how that influenced the histories, who gets told, and how that even impacts today. So once I kind of had this intro, it all became, where do I start this story, right? You have so much to grasp. I could have placed it right at the 20th century or after US occupation, but I didn't think that did justice to the rich indigenous and Latino communities that already were there before the creation of the US. So I really wanted to include this pre-US sort of side. So an important theme that I alluded to earlier is the sheer role that women had in these family networks and communities before US occupation and the institution of English common law. And so, as a part of the history, since 1540, you have the arrival of the Coronado expedition and the arrival of Spanish-speaking women with their families, who are all helping for the founding of Santa Fe in 1610, San Antonio in 1718, and Los Angeles in 1781. So women and families are being incentivized by the Spanish colonial government to go and settle them. Actually, majority of them were mestizo, mulatto. And while, we have this more of a fictive representation of being of more Spanish fictive past, it's important to know that these race and class hierarchies were also there and prevalent on the Mexico far frontier. And so during this time, you have women participating in day-to-day occupations. They're playing instrumental roles in economic development. Once again, referencing Isabel, she's overseeing this big ranch. But the more common is where women are helping and managing small family farms, either as vaqueros or cowgirls or in other capacities. And I came across a book by Dina Gonzalez's. It's called Refusing the Favor, the Spanish-Mexican Women of Santa Fe. And she touches a lot about how women under Spanish and Mexican law had certain rights not afforded elsewhere. So they could use the court to fight for battles, own land and property, kept maiden names when we're married, things sort of like that. It's not to overstate, the exercise of those rights, because of course there was a balance, just like their Euro-American counterparts. So there's records of, yes, women suing in the courts, but still treading that line between not going over some sort of idea or image that they had to being sort of like a delicate lady. So during this research, I came across this fascinating figure of La Tulis, or Lady Tulis. So you see her here. This is actually a sketch that was done for Harper's Monthly magazine. And so she moved to New Mexico after Mexico gained independence from Spain with her family. And she opens up La Sala, which is a gambling saloon for the game of Spanish Monte, which was brought over during the Mexican-American War. And so you see La Sala becoming an opportunity to truly acculturate Euro-Americans, you know, coming back from the Mexican-American War along the trails through Santa Fe. And I thought it was really important because it shows just the role that her saloon had in kind of acclimating Euro-Americans to the local cultures and habits. And this actually here is an illustration by Diana Breyer. It was commissioned for La Herencia magazine, and she wrote about it and about the inspiration and behind the painting. She goes, La Tulis was the wealthiest woman in the territory, a successful business owner, an emancipated woman, and a role model for others. Although the Easterners who came to Santa Fe judged her by their own standards, I decided to portray her with a cigarette in her mouth because at that time, smoking was a symbol of liberation for women. I tried to be as accurate and historically correct as possible in depicting the furnishings and clothing from the era, since Doña Tulis was a fashion trend that was admired by many local women and may well have contributed to the Santa Fe style still popular today. And unfortunately, La Sala and the representation of La Tulis and her character were then used for this broader message of the Manifest Destiny. You know, they're depicting Spanish-Mexican population and especially Spanish-American women as semi-civilized people obsessed with gambling and drinking and who could really benefit from U.S. occupation and annexation. So I really wanted to use her history, her story, to kind of represent the impacts that then had with the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So as I moved on, I once again wanted to pick back off and just show how that impacted the Hispanic and Latino communities. So you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and you see a series of effects, right? So you start to, people are being relegated to lower wage jobs, they're being portrayed as inferior because of their Spanish roots, Spanish language, and they're also starting to experience serious land loss. And so I just wanted to expand on that notion that this didn't all happen in a vacuum. These lands were occupied by Hispanic, Latino, indigenous communities before the creation of the United States. And it's important to note that that social fabric that was instituted during that time really had profound effects on the way that women then organized in the Latina suffrage movement. So trying to drawing that line between the pre and the movement. Later on, I also briefly touch on the Chicana movement. And so I wanted to include Maria Ruiz de Burton here, who actually they call her as a precursor to this movement. So she's writing novels during this time, speaking out about US imperialism, racism, women's marginality, and manifest destinies in her novels. So she's kind of inserting that California perspective into a narrative through her novels. So I thought it was important to kind of put her here and then reference it back when we see the Chicana movement come into full force to just show how these themes are all interrelated. So after that whole background and setting that up, the question actually truly became, where do I start? So we have so many stories in different states and regions of different communities, and it was kind of like trying to organize it all together. So I did it by sake of state and territories, and that was just for ease of organization. But while doing that, I wanted to truly pull out those themes that I had started with Lucrecia to kind of give it some fluidity. And so I started with New Mexico, and that was deliberate because New Mexico has this really different sort of experience. You know, you have Latino women who are very powerfully connected because their family occupy positions in local and state governments. And here I include Nina Otero-Warren, and she was a huge figure in the suffrage movement in New Mexico. So I wanted to center her voice and her experiences to kind of tell the rest of the history and trajectory of New Mexico. So for example, her uncle was involved in the writing of the New Mexico Constitution, and due to fears of, you know, the US occupation, they're losing lands, they made it extremely hard to amend. That was to protect religious freedoms for Catholics and the provisions of Spanish language. So that actually sparked that the suffrage movement in New Mexico was much more focused on a national amendment rather than a state amendment, because they found it way too hard to kind of amend the Constitution, so they put all their efforts into this national movement. And here you'll see a clipping from the Santa Fe New Mexican. And before kind of moving into New Mexico's history introductory, I want to take a step backwards to kind of recap, because how women got involved in the suffrage movement originally started with women's clubs. So there originally are social clubs and, talking about community issues, and then you have the temperance union movement. And so women start believing that they need to have more of a role to advocate for their rights and their children's. So that kind of politicizes them. And as they start to get involved in the suffrage movement, their focus on the national amendment really draws out attention from prominent US national suffrage leaders. So for example, Miss Carrie Chapman Chatt. And so just a really neat clipping from 1919 showing that these women are coming all the way to Albuquerque to discuss these issues. So this photo here is from the National Women's Party, and it's a pretty remarkable one. It's from a 1915 march where women across ethnic lines came out to make a statement in support of women's rights, with the National Women's Party formerly known as the Congressional Union. So it really shows that centrality that New Mexico played on this movement. It became a place where leaders from all over the country came and really became a place for discourse. And through that, these national leaders really saw that they had to alliance with or really focus on these Spanish-speaking women. So here I have a picture of Aurora Lucero White, Leah, and so she was a huge part of this movement as well. She was a gifted orator from Las Vegas, New Mexico, and she, along with Arabella Pomero, who I didn't get a chance to include, gave speeches at this 1915 march. And she has this quote, and she goes, "I speak for the Spanish-American women who, while conservative, want the best possible laws where their home life is the question at issue." So once again, tying back to that themes of their involvement, first with Women's Club and the Temperance Union. And so they really become these prominent leaders because of their political connections with their families. I also didn't include Lola Armijo, which just due to space, but she's also an important figure in New Mexico. She was the first female in the state government and appointed as state librarian in 1912. So this here, it's not showing up, but it's a corrido, and it's from PBS, and it comes from the New Mexico in the Vote podcast by Megan Kamrick. Encourage you to check it out. It has great information, and there's a great article on it in Smithsonian Folklife. But for me, this corrido, I came across it and was absolutely just intrigued by it, because these corridos comes from the Spanish verb correr, and it's these ballads that are usually written and sung by men talking about the political themes of the day. But this one, it takes on a woman perspective. Although we don't have a known author, it just talks about women, challenging these traditional roles in their society, then getting the right to vote, and then kind of a satirical analysis of how women are going to expand their role in society. So I wanted to include this within this portion just to pay respect to that strong tradition in New Mexico of these Spanish-speaking women really challenging these norms and using their connections to kind of expand their role. And going off that theme of Spanish-speaking women, I tied it to California because you have incredible work being done here by Maria Lopez, and she's an educator, went to UCLA, and her focus really is on translating suffrage materials into Spanish. So this flyer, I found it, I thought it was extremely just relevant, shows you just exactly the kind of groundwork that was being done, translating these things so Spanish-speaking women understand what this movement is about, what it means to them. And then I also included a portion on Selena Solomons, who was also focused on the state proposition. And so in contrast to New Mexico that was focusing on this national amendment, you have California that gets a state proposition 4 up for vote. And actually in 1911, they pass it with the work of Selena and Maria, which allows women the right to vote 9 years before it becomes on a national amendment. So just kind of showing again the different timelines between the states. Then I moved on into Texas, and in contrast to New Mexico as well, Mexican Americans in Texas did not have the same sort of political connections. Moreover, most of them were poor sharecroppers who were disenfranchised by Jim Crow laws, like the poll tax and, extra legal threats of violence. So Jovita Idár and the Villarreal sisters are living in this reality, very connected to their Mexican heritage and advocating for the better treatment of Mexican Americans and the advancements of women's suffrage. And they're doing it through the press. So using that as a form of communication to kind of propel their ideas and voice all their their movement. So Jovita Idár, has this monumental stance against the Texas Rangers at a newspaper she's working at in El Progreso. She published an article kind of condemning Woodrow Wilson's decision to send troops to the border. So they come, try to shut it down, and she has a standoff with them. And so they later eventually are able to close it down when she's not there, but still this moment becomes extremely symbolic. And in this, and Andrea and Teresa Villarreal, I really wanted to include their story because you have them, they're born in Mexico, have to flee during the Mexican Revolution, and are also end up landing in San Antonio, Texas, and are also using the press to kind of advocate for, against the revolution, against this mistreatment, but also advancing women's rights. So in Texas, it really becomes kind of involved with this story of journalism and press, and it's a very kind of neat dynamic. So before moving on to Florida, and I didn't include New York, so I kind of want to back up and give a little explanation. So New York and the Northeast region are specifically getting a slide dedicated to them, but that's for no other reason than just bandwidth. The state and region also has an important history that's actually very similar to Florida due to women's employment in cigar and tobacco factories and their involvement in political labor movements. So in New York, you have a huge influx of Cuban and Puerto Rican communities. And I try to tie this story later on with Luisa Capetillo. So using that strand, I kind of inadvertently hit it. But as I'm talking about Florida, I want you to know how interconnected they are and make sure it gets covered through that sort of route. And so in Florida, specifically in Ybor City, and it's a neighborhood of Tampa, you have these rise of these ethnic clubs and mutual aid societies, which basically provide support for these immigrant communities. If you need medical assistance, food, they're kind of your support. They also had cultural events, and that's meant to celebrate their homeland heritage, and you had clubs kind of dedicated to each culture. So for example, you had El Centro Español, El Centro Asturiano, El Círculo Cubano, La Unión Martí Maceo, La Unión Italiana, each with areas of Latin civic life, and they built their own clubhouse to host these events. So La Unión Martí Maceo it's an Afro-Cuban club, and they were actually the first to create a women's committee tasked with organizing social functions. So following that lead, actually, other Latino organizations and women of other Latino origins in their clubs kind of use that model to institutionalize their support and voice within these clubs. You also have a direct tie to the cigar and tobacco industry. So you have the dissolution of the Cigar Makers International Union. And actually, a lot of this news is coming from Cuba, mostly Afro-Cuban workers in Havana. They're having their strikes, and they're calling for their communities then in Florida to also take up this cause. So it's also important to note that link that it's happening with New York, Florida, Cuba, Puerto Rico. It's all kind of interrelated. And so here you have a picture of the women at their benches of a cigar factory. And these women are really getting politicized through the lector, which is a reader who's, reading the news, talking about the political themes of the day. And so you start to see taking up strikes within the 1800s, 1900s. And during these times, they actually cooperate along cultural, ethnic, racial class lines. But then in moments of more stability, they would go back to their clubs. And so as single-sex organizations emerged in the African-American and Anglo communities, that's kind of where room for Latina activists also emerged. And so as part of a background note, I really wanted to use Florida, as I mentioned a little briefly earlier, for this larger conversation with Puerto Rico and the pan-Hispanic movement, because you start to see this differing strand of feminism, right? It doesn't only embody the right to vote and women's suffrage, but also a concern with an embodiment of human rights and a better life for their family. So here I include, the story of Luisa Capetillo. She's born in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. And she kind of emerges this concern over class struggle and economic prosperity. She rejects this idea of limited suffrage based on education, and she really uses these philosophies as she travels to Cuba and New York and Florida. So for me, she's kind of representative of all these strands connecting. And so she actually becomes one of the first women in New York to read as a female lectora there. And she publishes a series of novels expressing her thoughts through her time living in New York and in Tampa. And so I include this clipping here of her made headlines, her wearing trouserettes, and actually in 1915 when she traveled to Cuba and participated in a sugarcane worker strike, she was arrested for causing a scene after, going against cultural and social norms and wearing pants in public. And then, here you have her in the US kind of setting this new sort of statement wearing trouserettes. I also thought it was really important to include the suffrage history of Puerto Rico because it's very different from mainland US. It's a different history and trajectory of obtaining the right to vote, the impacts of US colonization on this territory, and the passage of the 19th Amendment. So work started with Luisa Capetillo and Ana Roque de Dupré, who's pictured here. However, in 1920, when the 19th Amendment passes, Genera Pagan goes to vote and she's denied, and it spurs this whole conversation about how the National Amendment applies to these US territories. It actually wouldn't be until 1929 that literate women can vote on the island, and in 1935 where all women can vote. So Laura Prieto has a great article about this, but she kind of makes these points that these women in Puerto Rico and in other territories weren't just passive recipients of this imperialist American suffrage movement. They sought alliances, but as we can see, they had their own perspective of suffrage. I think that's truly exemplified by Luisa Capetillo's work. And with that, they still had these complicated issues with voter suppression. So like in 1929, when it's first passed, they tried to limit it to middle and upper class women who could read, and Luisa Capetillo really kind of rejected that. So I wanted to briefly dive in. I only got a slide dedicated to this, but it's the Pan-Hispanic Feminism movement. There's a great book just put out by Catherine Moreno called Feminism for the Americas. And I just wanted to show how these themes are traveling. It's not just a vacuum, Puerto Rico, Central, Latin America. And it gives voice to these women in this region and their work and their involvement in making this international human rights movement, right? So you have Doris Stevens in the Inter-American Commission really advocating for the legality and that right to vote, whereas these Latin American suffragists are focused on truly challenging multiple forms of oppression and social, economic, and cultural. So it's important to note that, it's not just focused with the right, but truly an embodiment of things towards this better life. So I just kind of wanted to put a glimpse in it, and, it begs further investigation. If you're interested, or encourage you to keep investigating and check it out. So after I touched on all these regions, moving from coast to coast, north to south, I wanted to bring it back, and I decided to put it at the passage of the 19th Amendment in the US. So you have it in June of 19, it passes and states start to ratify. You have the story of how New Mexico becomes a central part. Otero-Warren is advocating and lobbying and on her state legislature for them to pass it, need 36 states to ratify, and eventually does. And it's important to note the way that women organize after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So, they have the right to vote and they start taking up positions in office, the state, local, national level. But beyond that, they really advocated in institutions and organizations that were heavily dominated by males. So while I do highlight Soledad Chavez de Chacon in New Mexico and the incredible story of Doña Fela in Puerto Rico, it becomes actually the first female mayor in all of the Western Hemisphere. I really wanted to kind of take this opportunity to expand on these sort of advocacy organizations that really came up after the passage of the 19th Amendment. So I had to include it all in one slide here. So it's hard to really capture the breadth of activism because, yes, they have the right to vote, but now they're really focused on advocating for their community and their community rights. So we have the creation of the League of United Latin American Citizens. And while women weren't allowed to join until 1933, onward from that, they really focused their efforts on desegregation, poll tax drivers, voter registration, and scholarship fundraising. And you have the work of Adela Slosvento, who's really integral to this. You also have the story of Luisa Moreno. She's an immigrant from Guatemala. She moves to the United States, gets involved in the American Federation of Labor, working in Spanish Harlem and Florida and the cannery women in California. And she becomes an organizer for the United Cannery Agricultural Packing and Allied Workers of America, and ultimately becomes the first Latina to hold a national union office. I also included Dolores Huerta here, so she dedicates her life towards organizing for improved labor conditions for farm workers. She does work with the Community Service Organization, meets Cesar Chavez, forms the United Farm Workers, and is really trying to address exploitations in pay, dangers in working conditions due to exposure to chemical pesticides, and industry-wide boycotts. through her fierce lobbying, she actually aided in the abolition of the U.S. Congress Bracero program, and she was key in passing the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, intended to protect the rights of agricultural laborers in California. And then kind of moving forward, I want to see how these Latina suffragists actually and advocacies impacted then the rise of the Chicana feminist movement. So the Chicana movement was predicated on the politics of the community, right? They worked on welfare rights, immigrant services, advocacy, anti-war protests, and trying to include Latino history in education and school curriculum. And through that, they organized La Raza Unida Party, feeling underrepresented in the male-dominated Chicana movement. So just showing how this work all translates to these waves, and then going back even to Maria Ruiz de Bouton that came earlier in the exhibition, how they kind of progress and build off of each other. And then here I included Banuelos, who was a Secretary of Treasury. I kind of wanted to bridge the 1960s as the present. So you have the Nixon administration, they nominate her as the Treasury, and then she sets the path for a series of other women to hold that position. So then you start seeing them becoming involved really in the cabinet of the government and kind of making these big positions in government. And then closing off, I really wanted to end off with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, just for the symbolism of it, right? And to show the power that Latinas have in shaping the national agenda and directing the political themes of the day. We have the representatives of these women, representing their communities and their heritage, advocating for better living conditions and for better opportunities. And so while it feels like I've swept a bunch of themes and histories in the concentrated exhibit, which was the hardest struggle, it is by no means a complete account, right? So I think it provides the opportunity for a launching point to expand and try to start expanding these histories together, because truly all these themes are interrelated. So I think the neatest part of it was getting to try to put it different regions, communities, timelines all together, and seeing how it provokes such a rich analysis of Latina activism in the United States. So with that, I'm going to conclude. It's been a lot of talking, but I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to the incredible people who helped me, Liz, Lori Ann, Kathleen Cahill, and all the incredible research that I consulted. I urge you to check out some of the works in the Works Cited, and now I will turn it over so we can go and answer some of the questions in the Q&A.
Mariana, there were a couple of questions. One said, is there a book available? Great information, thank you for sharing. Can you cite some of I know you did in your presentation, but maybe some of the books that were helpful to informing this exhibit?
Yeah, of course. So if you then want them written down, they're at the end in this next slide. They're in the Works Cited, but some great ones, as I mentioned, Kathleen Cahill has some great work out on recasting the vote. You have Catherine Moreno, Feminism for the Americas. Nancy Hewitt has some great one on Southern Discomfort, but I encourage you, I listed them all on the Works Cited page here. So if you want to go through that, a lot of the research is drawn from those resources.
Paige asked about the standoff. Can you tell us more about that story?
Yeah, of course. So Jovita Idár, here, I'll go back just so we can have her image up. So she is born and raised in Texas, and she gets involved in journalism with La Crónica, which was her father's newspaper, actually. And so she volunteers during the Mexican Revolution, as a nurse. And so she comes back and actually ends up working for El Progreso, a newspaper, also advocating for Mexican-American rights. And she publishes this article just going against Woodrow Wilson's decision to send troops to the border. And they catch wind of it. He calls in the Army, the Texas Rangers, to kind of go to the office and to shut it down. And so she makes a statement of her. She tries to block the doors, not let them in. They eventually give up and leave. However, they do come back a few days later when she's not there and end up closing the offices. But that history is still credited as that symbolic moment of her trying to not let them take away that freedom of speech, of her to speak out against this, because those were her beliefs, and continue to advocate for the Mexican-American reality in Texas.
California allowed women to vote in 1911, and you said that the women who went to Columbia in 1917 weren't able to vote. Were there any limitations to women's voting in California, Latinas and non-Latinas, i.e. poll tax or literacy exams, etc., much like the southern states did to Black women?
So in California, right, so it passes in 1911 with Proposition 4. So there was an age restriction. So 21 years was the age that was actually limited. So while Lucrecia was 18 in 1911 when it was passed, you couldn't vote till 21. But other than that, they were allowed to vote.
This is a great one. Claudia asks, what was the most surprising information you learned while putting together this exhibit?
Oh, it's a tough one. I just think for me, it's just when I go back to that title, I'm researching these incredible women and just the breadths of activism and how they're using their Hispanic and Latino culture to kind of influence their ideas of activism. So, it wasn't straightforward of just protests. We have Lucrecia in the Mission play, we have women taking up to the press. So it just shows such a multifaceted form of advocacy. And I think that for me was truly just the really inspirational point of it.
Okay, Ava asks, she says, thank you for a great exhibit and presentation. You spoke about a few Latinx leaders in the space that emerged after the initial suffrage movement. Could you suggest some other current voices, organizations, or news outlets we can look to today for a more intersectional perspective on women's rights?
Yeah, so today, so actually a lot of these organizations are still doing work. So, LULAC still is pretty active. I think I urge you to look at now these women in recent offices, which I include on the last slide, those have taken up in the more recent years. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and kind of the work and programs that they're organizing around.
Bear with me while I scroll, please. Do you have any more information about the progression of women's suffrage between the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the passage in 1929 of literate women suffrage in Puerto Rico?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Information about the progression of women's suffrage between the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 and the passage in 1929 of literate women's suffrage in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, so in terms of resources, I encourage you to check out Laura Prieto. She has some great work, articles online. And then I think if you research more, Luisa Capetillo and Ana Roque de Dupré, they're kind of extremely involved in those years in that gap until 1929 and, those specific organizations. And while I didn't get to touch on it in this, presentation on the slides, they kind of talk more about those organizations that are leading up to that 1929 passage.
How do you see Sonia Sotomayor's appointment to the Supreme Court affected by this movement?
So, for me, it's just like when I kind of got to the end, just showing I right on the last slide, just shattering these glass ceilings. So I think Banuelos was one of those moments where you have the highest person of Latino descendants in, the cabinet. So then to the Supreme Court, once again, you just have these Latino women shattering these glass ceilings and taking along with them their heritage and their voice.
Remember, you can take your time with this exhibit if you visit womenshistory.org. You can access the exhibit on our homepage, but also check out all of our other wonderful exhibits that we have online, our virtual exhibits. We have quite an extensive collection, and this one is available in English and Spanish. And again, I want to thank our partner, NBCUniversal Telemundo Enterprises, for all of their incredible help with this exhibit. And they were just fantastic partners in helping us curate and deliver this exhibit and some of our other Spanish language resources on our website. Martha Wheelock. Hi, Martha. Good to see you here. Did cultural forces of Latinas affect how they worked for suffrage in a country which held biases? Sorry, my type is so small.
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Let me say that again. Did cultural forces of Latinas affect how they worked for suffrage in a country which held biases?
Extremely. I think that kind of it shaped their whole notion of what suffrage was, and kind of as I get some more embodiment of human rights and forms and opposing forms of oppression, I think that their cultural forces are what influenced that, their direct realities that they faced. Then it wasn't just the right to vote, wasn't just suffrage, it was advocating for their communities and for better rights for them and better opportunities.
And then I also, do you have any information about Latina women in the Midwest?
Yeah, so I just by scope of breadth and reach, I didn't include Midwest, but I encourage you to check out the encyclopedia I mentioned, Latinas in the United States, edited by Vicky Ruiz and Virginia Corral. It's in the Works Cited. They do a whole passage on each region and dive it up individually, so you can kind of read on all the activism by region.
Great, thank you. Well, it looks like we're at the end of our questions. Mariana, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you for being here with me today. I encourage you to go through it on the website, go through it slowly. And once again, how I said, this isn't the entirety of the story. It's a start, and I, urge you to continue researching into it and expanding the voices of these women and kind of understanding how it shaped the women's suffrage and continues to today.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that joined us here today. Again, please visit our website, womenshistory.org. We have just a wonderful selection of exhibits and biographies and articles and great content that you can check out to learn more about women's history. We also have a lot of content for young learners, and we hope you continue to join us for the rest of the month and into the future, into 2021, as we bring you more programming. And of course, this will be posted on our website, so if you've missed any of our other Sundays at Home, we encourage you to check out our website too and see those presentations. We have another virtual walkthrough, we have author discussions, and in January we'll have some of our Brave Girls story time for young learners, lots of great content. So thank you again for joining us and spending your Sunday afternoon with us, and we'll talk to you all soon.